These are organizations that usually, there's kind of two contexts in Africa, kind of just speaking broadly, where we see these arise. One is with small democratic societies, like we find in the Bight of Biafra, where the political societies are quite small, they're democratic, and then these societies exist to kind of unify people over a large area who are politically independent, but this gives them a kind of a unity and allows them to kind of share and overlap with their neighbors. So it allowed for long distance travel because people who were members of these societies could go to another place where they had no relatives, didn't know anyone, maybe didn't even speak the language. But these societies, because these societies practiced, for example, in the Bight of Biafra, a form of written and gestural language. So even if we spoke a different language, I spoke Efik and you spoke Igbo, but we're both initiated in the society, I can write on the ground or something, I can write to you, and I can speak to you through a gestural language called Nsibidi. The other kind of place where we see these societies come up is kind of as a response to despotic power, where empires grew up and people were forced into things that they didn't want to, and these were as a way of resistance against this despotic power when you didn't have political, direct political power. These initiation societies allowed people to kind of respond and protect themselves to a certain way and act in collectivity, but without the danger of being, as individuals, being labeled as, rebels or whatever, because everything was through, kind of secret, right? And when we look at, when we look at the Maltas in Rio in the 19th century, they really, I try not to use the term gangs because it really doesn't, it's not appropriate, because if you really look at the organization, these are segmented structures where you have local chapters in each parish church, but then you have these overarching structures that link them together. You don't see that in 19th century street gangs. And the fact that they fight doesn't make them a gang. If you look at 19th century fire departments here in New York City, they fought over territories, and if there was a fire here in New York and 2 fire brigades showed up, they duked it out, pulled out knives, and they'd literally be killing each other in the street while the house is burning down to protect their turf. But we wouldn't call them a gang because that's not their primary function. Do you understand what I'm saying? And when we look at the Maltas, they have a primary function. That primary function is the preservation and furthering of this esoteric practice, which is capoeira. So, and excuse me, because I'm dealing in the 19th century, I don't use the term capoeiristas. In the 19th century, people who practiced the jogo de capoeira were called capoeiras. And these are not like street gangs. These are highly hierarchical societies with level of initiation. So, for example, if we're talking about in Angola, where I work, a young boy who's uninitiated is called a moleque. And this is the name in Brazil for the first level of initiation. So these Maltas had, as in the initiation societies in West Central Africa, moleques were young kids who had not yet been initiated, but in the 19th century Rio, these were like the groupies who would be then move into the next phase called caxingueles, and that's when they would start their formal training. You'd move up this level that had, in the first half, by the first part of the 19th century, the first half, probably 5 levels. By the second half of the 19th century, there's clearly 6 levels. I don't know how far back that goes. Again, the problem is it's all the internal workings are internal and it's secret, so we don't have a lot of details from insider sources. So, and as with the initiation societies in West Africa, they played paramilitary roles and policing roles. So in those small democratic societies, if people weren't listening to what the elders say, the society would send out people to physically punish the offenders. That's what they did. And the capoeira societies, the Maltas, did the exact same thing. They, They would punish even masters who kind of, if there was a capoeira who was under the protection of one of these societies, they weren't allowed to be sold outside of Rio. A master could sell them to another master in Rio, but if they sold them to outside, then the capoeira societies would send someone to teach that master a lesson for not, so they offered protection, kind of tangible protections to enslaved Africans or Afro-Brazilians or capoeira. So when we look at the capoeira maltas in the late 18th century and early half of the 19th century, it was primarily enslaved Africans. The slave trade ends in Rio, maybe around 1850 roughly. It's technically illegal since the 1830s, but the clandestine trade continues. So you have a switch in the mid-19th century, and by the second half of the 19th century, it's more free people of color. In 1860, we have the first white capoeira initiated into a capoeira society that we know of. And there was a war against War of the Triple Alliance from 1865 to 1870, and in that time we had a significant number of Europeans, French, and other Europeans who were initiated, primarily Portuguese though, initiated into these capoeiras in that time period. But there was this change. So in the second half of the 19th century, it's primarily free people of color, although along with whites, and by the late 19th century, you have elite whites being initiated into these capoeira societies. So there's that transformation, but so in terms of the structure, to call these gangs is really, imposing, a structure that it wasn't. It was a completely different structure than a 19th century street gang. These were organized institutions, and their initiations, ceremonies, and stuff were secret. Only initiates could do it. And the other thing about these closed societies in Africa, even though they're secret, what the knowledge that goes on inside is secret. They had periodic public exhibitions that entertained people, and the capoeiras the capoeira societies in Rio did that as well. Particularly during religious festivals or at funerals, the capoeiras would perform either the jogo de capoeira, or sometimes they were known to in the bell towers do these kind of crazy flips like Master Aranya was doing when he was playing with you, to knock the bells, and people were watching them in the church towers, like getting a show out of it. So all those kind of elements don't have a correlate in street gangs. This is something else. I think if you analyze the structure, the parallel is much closer with these societies.